I'm Father Columbus Stewart, the Executive Director of the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, and I'm delighted to see all of you here this afternoon for what I believe is the second of our speakers in this fall Hemel series. It's my great pleasure to introduce my friend Dr. Nicholas Al-Jeloo. We first met at the Symposium Syriacum in Granada, Spain. I think we actually met at the airport, and then we got to know each other a bit during that conference, and our paths have crossed at subsequent symposia. Nicholas is from Australia, but he is a member of the Assyrian community, more particularly the Assyrian Church of the East, popularly but improperly known as the Nestorian Church, the ancient East Syriac tradition. His family comes from an area which covers a region which now is divided between Turkey, Iran, and Iraq. Ancient Mesopotamia, with its very important Semitic Christian tradition, an area much in our minds in the news these days because of what's happening in both the civil war in Syria and then the recent uprising with ISIS, or the Islamic State as it prefers to call itself. An area that even before the past year's news has been very important for the work of Hemel, since we've been actively digitizing manuscripts in Turkey, Iraq, and Syria for a number of years. Nicholas, as a native of Australia, studied at the University of Sydney. He also studied at Leiden in the Netherlands. He's had extensive field work in the countries that I've just mentioned, including some very interesting field work in Iran, where there's a very significant Christian past which we forget about, given our awareness of Shia Muslim culture in Iran these days. He's very active in professional societies, the kinds of conferences that someone with this interest would attend, related to Semitic languages, to archaeology, to the history of these ancient and important Christian communities. We've been delighted to have him at Hemel for, sadly, a short visit, but I think it will be the first of many, and I hope the first sign of what could be very fruitful collaboration as we continue our efforts to preserve the culture of that part of the world. He's published articles and essays. He's published a very useful book. You didn't know I had this, perhaps. I didn't. Which is a dictionary of modern Aramaic, because Nicholas, in addition to knowing ancient Semitic languages and classical Syriac, also can speak the actual spoken Syriac or Aramaic dialect of his people, and in collaboration produced this very useful phrase book. So next time you need to hail a taxi in certain parts of northern Iraq, you just flip through the pages of this little book and it'll tell you how to do it. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Nicholas Al-Jeloo to you, who will speak to us today on religion, science, and superstition, and stepping out from his East Syriac background to talk to us about medicine and magic in West Syriac milieu, and I'll let you explain the difference. Thank you. Nicholas.
Thank you. Firstly, I'd like to thank you all for attending. I'd like to thank Brother Columba for that really amazing introduction. I was sort of sitting there saying, who is he talking about? Until I realized he's talking about me. It's really an honor and a blessing to be here at St. John's University, and hopefully I'll be back again soon. Now, I'm speaking about the Syriac language, texts in the Syriac language. For those that are not familiar with the term Syriac, Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic which served as a vehicle for the expression of Christianity in most of the Middle East since the 1st or 2nd centuries AD. And it still survives as a literary language, mostly used by Assyrians or by Chaldeans, Syriacs, and those kinds of churches which are from Iraq, Turkey, and Syria. Now, I am going to be talking about the West Syriacs, or the Western Assyrians, but they're just a very small part of my talk. I'm going to start firstly with the Eastern ones. So, bear with me. And the East and West divide is generally the River Tigris. You'll mostly find that people that speak Eastern dialects of Syriac are found east of the River Tigris in parts of Iraq, Iran, and parts of Turkey, and those that speak the Western are on the other side of the Tigris, sort of in Syria and other parts of Turkey and Lebanon. So, we'll start it with a map. Now, the autumn of 1933 heralded the start of a plan by the French Mandate government of Syria to settle roughly 13,000 Assyrian refugees fleeing massacre in Iraq on the banks of the Khabur River in the northeastern part of the country. So here you can see a map of that area. It's in Al-Hasaka province, which is now unfortunately a battleground of ISIS or ISIL. Here you can see the first villages that were established for those refugees in the 1930s, and groups of those people that were settled by the French who had come in from Iraq. Now, prior to that, these people had lived in the lush highlands of Hakkari in what is now southeastern Turkey. But they left their original homes in 1915, not knowing that they would never return. So, just a few pictures to give you an idea of the scenery. You can imagine a very alpine district, a lot of mountains, a lot of greenery, and then all of a sudden being plonked into the middle of the desert of that northern part of Syria. Luckily, these refugees managed to bring with them what they deemed to be precious items which formed the cornerstones of their identity. Among these items were valuable manuscripts which they managed to salvage from destruction. Now, over 80 years later, the mud brick hamlets with beehive houses established on the Khabur steppes, which had recently expanded into modern villages and towns, are threatened due to the ongoing violence in the country. The strategic area, once known as Syria's breadbasket, is now the battleground of Islamist rebels and Kurdish separatists. So this just gives you an idea of the terrain all around the Khabur River, which you can see right there. And this is the sort of mud brick villages that people are still living in. The Assyrians, who still preserve and practice their ancient customs and pray in much the same way as their ancestors did in the timeless stone churches of the Hakkari highlands, according to the rites and rituals of the Church of the East, are now leaving their villages in droves as they seek out better lives in Europe, Australia, and North America. So, just to give you an idea, these are some of their churches that are still in Turkey. Until now, they have kept many of the manuscripts which their ancestors had brought with them, and to this day, they lovingly protect them from unnecessary damage. Today, however, their lifestyle is severely endangered, and the fate of many of these precious artifacts is unknown. And this is where our journey begins. Between September and November 2009, I embarked on finishing a project which I had begun in the summer This is the owner of one of those texts. He's actually holding a book of medicines in his hand. Now, I at once remained on the alert for any other manuscripts I could find, and even searched out purported owners of such texts, often with favourable outcomes. In total, I photographed 8 original manuscripts and 3 facsimiles of the Book of Medicines and Book of Protection, which I'll mention in a bit. Unfortunately, 2 manuscript owners refused to allow access, denying that they possessed any such manuscripts, and another provided access but did not allow photography. In December that same year, I managed to make the same inquiries whilst in northern Iraq, and again found material to photograph and to record. There, 2 original manuscripts were photographed, as well as 3 facsimiles of the Book of Medicines and the Book of Protection. Now here you can see another owner of a Book of Protection manuscript. He writes amulets for the local Arabs in the surrounding villages. And I asked the local bishop about it. His name is Arsanis. And I said, Your Grace, you know, I've heard Arsanis has a manuscript. And he says, oh yeah, Arsanis the witch doctor. And there you have another gentleman who has a whole box of manuscripts. And this is my friend who recently passed away in Iraq. He had a very good collection of manuscripts, and one of them was a Book of Medicines from the 18th century. So, I'm going to talk a bit about the Book of Medicines. Syriac literature, whilst largely Christian in nature, is known for its wide variety of genres. The rarest of these, which may be termed fringe literature, includes those texts which deal with scientific or knowledge-related topics. Such texts may comprise medical treatises, omens, astrological texts, dream interpretation, divination, incantations, spells, charms, and amulets. Not very Christian, I might hear some of you say. Often, more than one of these would be consulted by practitioners of folk medicine in administering remedies that would have been simultaneously scientific and spiritual. Whereas interest in such genres has continued well into the 21st century, with studies on Syriac medicine and magic still somewhat popular today, these works actually comprise one of the least studied Syriac literary genres. And that, titled simply Sparsamane, or the Book of Medicines, is the most common of these. It is a work which arouses strong feelings of mystery in most Assyrians today, who call it the Parsumane, with a great number of original manuscripts jealously guarded by their owners from inquisitive eyes. To them, it is their livelihood and source of income, since they use it to perform divination and copy amulets for generous clients. The Sparsamane exists in many different recensions and versions, with most manuscripts originating from northern Iraq and southeast Turkey, largely within an East Syriac milieu. It should be further noted here that mentions of manuscripts belonging to this genre survive from further afield. So here you can see the area where most of these manuscripts are found, so this red triangle here. And then this is the Turabdin, which is to the west of the Tigris River, and I'm going to be mentioning this area in a little bit. Now, I said that mentions of this manuscript were found a little bit further afield. The disastrous, I'm going to call it disastrous, I don't know, some people might not agree, but the disastrous Synod of Diamper in southern India, held in 1599 by invading Portuguese prelates from the Roman Catholic Church, for instance, in its effort to erase every trace of the native Church of the East heritage, banned a long list of quote-unquote Nestorian books which were to be burnt, including the Parsimon, or Book of Persian Medicines, which is exactly the Sparsamane. Interestingly, fragments of medicinal texts and amulets have survived from a cache of manuscripts dating back to between the 8th and 14th centuries, found in the ruins of a Church of the East monastery in the Turfan Oasis in western China. Among them are prayers for protection and the recipe for a potion to make hair grow. Now here you can see some of these manuscripts that are now held in Berlin. At the present time, there is one uncritical edition. So it was made from only one manuscript of the Sparsa Mane. And that's the only one that's ever been published and translated into English. It was done by Sir Ernest Allen Wallace Butch in 1913. The translation of another version into Neo-Aramaic, so I should explain, the modern dialect of Aramaic spoken by the Assyrians, was published in Chicago during the 1990s. This was also not a critical edition and made no use of any parallel texts. Interestingly, the translator also added a reproduction of 3 amulet texts from the Book of Protection, first published by Hermann Gollange. Such texts had previously been mentioned by Badger in 1850 and Wigram in 1914, and are known to the Assyrians as Kherze, or amulets, Paroshe, separators, Ktibiyate, writings, and Tashriyoto, or stories. Despite the general dearth of study on this text, the Sparsa Mane remains one of the most intriguing and widely copied fringe genres in Syriac literature. So here you can see examples of some of these amulets. This is a Syriac amulet, which would have been rolled or folded, and it's now kept in the Museum of Dahuk in northern Iraq. Just for some perspective, here's another one, which I found in one of the villages in Syria, but this is a modern one. It's sort of been photocopied. It hasn't really been copied down by hand. And this is one in Mandaic. So the Mandaeans were an ancient Gnostic religion from southern Iraq, and they also wrote their prayers and their holy books in Aramaic, and they have a similar tradition of amulets. Now, in the 1898 catalogue of the American College at Urmia's collection of Syriac manuscripts, and Urmia is a town in northwestern Iran. Now, this collection was completely destroyed in World War I. 21 out of 232 manuscripts, so roughly 9% of the collection, contained material from this genre. Among the more common titles, apart from the Book of Medicines and the Book of Protection and Amulets, you will find the Book of Omens, book concerning all the organs of the human body, Book of Sorcery, Book of Unbinding Sorcery, Book of Fortunes and Spells, Book of Dream Interpretation, the Acts of Simon Magus, and the Book of Astrology. At times, a manuscript may be found dedicated to one of these texts, and at others, it is quite common for any 2 or more to be combined with one another in the same volume. It is thus not uncommon to find up to 5 of these texts in the one manuscript. In other cases, these texts are lumped together with other unrelated texts, such as the Book of Proverbs, histories of saints, or stories of biblical figures, or even the story of Ahikar, the scribe of Sennacherib, king of Nineveh. In 2 cases, the Sparsa Mane is found in large manuscripts of selected writings containing, among other things, interpretations of difficult names in the Bible, interpretations of personal names, the plan of the world and chronography of time, calendars, poems, a history of paradise, a story on the penitent demon, and the epistles of the Catholicoi. Now this is all very technical, but the Sparsa Mane, or this genre of the Book of Medicines, is first attested to in manuscripts from the Hakkari Highlands, more specifically the Valley of Tchuma, dated to the 5th and 13th centuries, which were viewed and copied from by the priest Oshana Saro and John son of Talia in the late 19th century. So here you can see, for those that know how to read Syriac, for those that don't, I'll sort of explain. This is one of them, and this one says that the book of Chaldeutha, so the book of sorcery or the book of Chaldeanism or astrology. And it says that it was copied in 1834 from a book that was 1,500 years older. So just shows that there was a tradition of copying manuscripts from one another. Now, these works concern the zodiac, planets and shooting stars, their orbits and names, their activities and signs that they cause, and concerning their effect on various characteristics, and divination through them. The title also reads, "This is the astronomy and astrology of the Chaldeans." And indeed, the term here used for astrology is Chaldeutha, i.e. Chaldeanism, or the art of the Chaldeans. Unfortunately, with the upheavals of the First World War, it is to be presumed that these manuscripts have no longer survived, although I've managed to track some down. Some are in Princeton, some are at the University of Chicago, but most haven't. Budge also mentions a manuscript of the Book of Medicines, presumably copied at a monastery near Mosul in the 12th century, from which his own copy was presumably made in 1894. Some copies have survived from the 17th century, and most are from the 18th or 19th centuries, continuing on into the 20th century, just after the First World War. Interestingly, the tradition of the Book of Medicines was continued in Baghdad from the 1960s to the 1980s, with Neo-Aramaic translations appearing in manuscript form as early as 1981. So here you've got a fairly new, this is a photocopy from a fairly new manuscript of the Book of Medicines, with, you've got the lots there, so people would close their eyes, put their finger on a square, and then down below you would see the explanation as to what that means. But here you have the same thing, and the text here is in Neo-Aramaic. So it was translated for people to understand. From a preliminary survey of manuscripts, it appears that the oldest dated Book of Protection, so the Book of Amulets, was copied in 1719, or one of the oldest. But I'll get back to that in a sec. So here you've got more of the Book of Medicines in Neo-Aramaic. Again, this is another one. This one's from Iraq. That one was from Syria. This is the one that the owner wouldn't let me photograph. So this is one of the oldest books of charms and amulets that I managed to find, and it was in a private collection. It dates back to 1719. And though the text is undoubtedly much older, since most amulets would have perished with their owners, and even many of the surviving texts are undated. Often, such manuscripts are to be found with priests or deacons of the church, and are usually written or copied by men with such ecclesiastical ranks. Almost all texts, such as these, ultimately originate from the rugged mountainous areas of the Assyrian triangle, so that red triangle that I showed on the map before, between Mosul and the cities of Van and Urmia. So here you've got some more photographs of some of these amulets. These are photographs of amulets that I found during my fieldwork, so they're from private collections. They're very similar to, this is Mandean art. So if you look at, this is a Syriac Christian amulet, and this is an illumination from a Mandean manuscript from southern Iraq. And you'll see that the artwork is very esoteric and very similar. But here you have more images from these amulets of saints killing dragons, killing large serpents. And it's very interesting that this tradition is shared not only by the neighboring Armenians, who have their own tradition of hmails or prayer scrolls, but also by the Ethiopians, who also have a very strong tradition of copying out amulets onto long rolls of paper that are then kept by the person that buys them or that has them copied. So these are just some illuminations showing various saints. So this is the saint Rabban Hormizd killing a lion or a dog. You know, and then you have, again, parallels in Mandaean art. Very, very similar, even though one is from northern Mesopotamia and one is from the south. This one, can't really see. This is the Archangel Gabriel, I think, killing a demon. You know, these manuscripts are full of them. These sorts of very crude but very colourful illustrations. This is not so colourful because it's from a photocopy. So, the fieldwork I conducted in Syria and Iraq in 2009-2010 produced probably what are the oldest surviving dated manuscripts of these texts to be properly documented. So, the Book of Man's Protection, which I found, let me find it first. There are more photographs like this. Okay. So, you'll find a lot of these illustrations. I think I've made my point. So, the Book of Man's Protection, copied in 1719, I found at the village of Telkefchi, which is right here, in this corner of Syria. And it was copied by the deacon Piro, son of Narsai, the priest Narsai of Dirigny in 1719. So imagine it, from being copied here, it ends up all the way here. And then the Book of Medicines, the oldest one that I found. This is it. It was in the city of Duhok, and it was copied by Hoshaba, son of the deacon Joseph, in July 1796, probably at the town of Al-Kosh, which is right here, and where Hummel has already done some digitization work. Interestingly, this manuscript contains no astrology, omens, or fortunes, and instead follows quite closely the sections on Greek and native medicines in the text published by Budge early last century. But, you know, the search isn't over yet, and obviously that's why I'm here at Hummel. So I'm going to briefly talk about the contents. As already noted, the Book of Medicines is not solely a book of medicines per se, and may in various recensions be lumped together with versions of the Book of Protection and Amulets, Book of Omens, Book concerning all the organs of the human body, Book of Sorcery, Book of Unbinding Sorcery, etc., etc. Budge, in his 1913 edition of one version, focused more on the section related to Greek Galenic medicine and astronomy and anatomy, and dismissed the astrological sections, as well as the section containing what he terms native medicines, as superstitious and of no value. Now here you'll see some of these astrological sections from manuscripts that I found in Syria. Again, you have the lots. In fact, these sections which I mentioned of astrology and of native medicine may not be of any medical worth, though they are vital to understanding the cultural milieu of the Syriac world in late antiquity and the Middle Ages. Moreover, most of the recensions I photographed in Syria and Iraq actually omit the Greek medical component of the text, and instead insert what Budge never found: the Book of Omens, the Book of Fortunes, Book of Dream Interpretation, and the Book of Protection. This ties in with the role of the physician as an astrologer, and has its parallels in ancient Assyrian medical practice, as noted by Budge. The fact that medical spells are added to some of the ancient, or to some of the Assyrian prescriptions, proves that the Assyrian physicians had not, in the 7th century BC, freed their system of medicine from the bonds of magic. So, if someone got well, you wouldn't ask whether it was the spell or the medicine that made them better. You just assume it was a mix of both. So the astrological component consists of a long series of short sections dealing with lunar calculations and tables, forecasts derived from the stars and comets, and here you can see some illustrations of comets, divinations, numerology, planets and their influences, the signs of the zodiac, their colors, signs and countries which they rule. Here you can see some astrological tables, the influences of stars on the lives of human beings, tables of lucky and unlucky days, calculations as to the probability of sick people recovering, auguries for journeys, the course of the circle of heaven, eclipses, divisions of time, portents from the treaties of Hermes, weather forecasts, even stuff about diets. Here, there are also given stylized tables of the night sky, and here you can see an English translation. So, unfortunately, Budge's translated them quite literally. So this is Cancer, and that's Aries, that's Capricorn. He's got them translated too literally, I would say. But this is a sort of translation of that. And that's sort of what you find in some of the Syriac manuscripts. So, often, the omens and forecasts relate to whole countries rather than to individuals, which was common in the Seleucid and pre-Seleucid eras. So the Seleucid era is the Mesopotamian Hellenistic period. So when the Greeks ruled Mesopotamia around the time of Alexander the Great and afterwards. It is interesting to note that amongst the ancient Mesopotamian names for planets, we also find Greek and Arabic names used in way of explanation. So this may suggest that the work of the Book of Medicines had undergone a process of editing and redaction, either during the Seleucid period or even later during the Islamic period. So here you can see, for example, the names of the zodiac signs, what they are in Syriac, and the names of the planets used in the Book of Medicines. So you have them in Syriac, Greek, and Arabic. Here also you have, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the signs for certain signs of the zodiac. Well, in Syriac we have them as well, they're just different. So that's the one for Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, etc., etc. And it even gives their specific colors. Now, the fact that it was redacted again in the Islamic period is probably true, since the edition published by Budge includes a table relating to the Babylonian calendar months, which adds to it another table relating to the months of the Islamic lunar calendar. Now, I'm going to get to that in a sec. I'll just show you, these are some of the, I would call them esoteric drawings. I don't know which other way to explain them, but these are found in many of the amulets. And this is a sort of textbook for copying out the amulets as well. And here you can see the table of the Islamic months, which is found in the version of the Book of Medicines published by Budge. So you've got written out in Syriac, Muharram, Safar, Rabi' al-Awwal, Rabi' al-Akhir, etc., etc. Now, it would be unthinkable to separate the Syriac tradition of the Book of Medicines, or the Book of Protection, from other works of this genre, from those of surrounding religions and ethnicities. For example, Jews were also reputed for their amulets and charms, which sometimes found an Assyrian clientele in much a similar fashion to what was occurring in Babylonia during the late antique period, with the overlap between Mandaic, Jewish Aramaic, and Syriac incantation bowls. And you can see an example of them right here. So the way these incantation bowls worked was they would usually draw a picture of the demon in the bottom of the bowl and then write the incantation around it. And then that would be buried under someone's front door in order to trap the demon so it would not enter the house. There's another one. Now, indeed, an oral tradition from the Hakkari region tells of a man named Mitchell from the village of Marzaya, who died in the snow as he returned from the Jewish village of Ustun, his pocket full of amulets with which he was to tame the crazy women of his village. Indeed, it would be interesting to find out whether or not the Aramaic-speaking community of Assyrian Jews in Israel today still practice this or not. Or there may even be extant texts in Jewish Aramaic or Jewish Neo-Aramaic which are yet to be discovered and studied. Now I'm going to go back to the Mandeans, who I've already mentioned a couple of times. They have a book called the Asfar Malwashi, or the book of the Zodiac. And it provides some parallels to many of the astrological components of the Book of Medicines, especially the names of the planets and zodiac signs. So here again you can see Mandaic manuscript. Shiite Muslims also share similar traditions to the Book of Medicines in that they attribute much of their divination practices and omen forecasts to the prophet Daniel. So here you see Kitab Daniel al-Nabi, who was a Jewish exile and prophet that lived in Babylon, had links with the royal court and Chaldean astronomers and astrologers, and was also known for his dream interpretation. Indeed, here you can see a bit of that text. And again, one that I found online. And for those that know Syriac, Shuda ad-Dani al-Nuya. So this is a book of omens attributed in Syriac to the prophet Daniel, just like in the Shiite Muslim Arabic text. Indeed, one text, the Ikhtiyarat al-Ayyam al-Shuhur, shows striking similarities with a similar Syriac text of omens and forecasts relating to the first day of the new year and what it foretells depending on what day of the week it begins on. Interestingly, it also shares the Syriac Hebrew numerological tradition with similar values assigned to the letters of the alphabet. And I think that's it here. So you can see, for those that know Syriac or Hebrew, this is exactly the same, with a little bit of difference obviously because Arabic has extra letters, but it's almost the same as the Syriac or Hebrew numbering system. Now, it is hoped in the near future that the various recensions of the Syriac text of the Book of Medicines known to exist may be compiled into one complete critical edition with a translation which can be then used as a reference to be compared with these other traditions, especially those of ancient Mesopotamia. This would be a mammoth task and would involve not only searching in Western collections, but also scouring those of the Syriac churches for any such texts which may still exist. And I should say, with great pride, that Hemel has digitized a lot of those collections, and that makes the job easier for researchers. Now, before I get onto that, I'll show a similar parallel amulet text. This one is written in Persian, and it's from a Kurdish village in northern Iraq. It's actually kept at the museum there now, and you will find illustrations such as this, which are very common in Syriac manuscripts, especially of this genre. And again, you have these sort of esoteric doodles and writings. These tables. I mean, it was shown to me by people in that local museum, and I thought I'd take some photographs of it, just for general value of comparison. But it's very, very interesting. So you have these again, just random letters and numbers. And then these weird drawings. In a recently published catalogue of the manuscript collection of the Assyrian Church of the East in Baghdad, there are between 5 and 10 items relating to this genre attested, which have not yet been studied. So that's the catalogue. So now I'm going to talk about the West Syriac milieu. Wow, that was a bit bright. I'm going to talk about the Western Syriacs and how they dealt with this issue of amulets and magic. As I've already mentioned, the standard texts of this genre, which immediately come to mind, are those from an East Syriac milieu. Noticeably, little consideration has been given, however, to the small amount of evidence which comes from just across the Tigris River. In 2008, however, it was brought to my attention by friends in Sweden that the Book of Protection, at least, survives in a West Syriac context among the Assyrians of the Turabdin region, with some prayers even written in Arabic and Garshuni, so Arabic written in Syriac characters, in a codex copied at the village of Angel as late as 1960, and this is it. So here you can see the bits in Arabic. And these are sort of written as prayers rather than as charms, but they're actually used as charms. This is another one. This codex is undated, but it was copied for Yeshua and for his wife Maryam, probably in the mid-20th century. And although written in the West Syriac script, contains prayers in Syriac and Garshuni with an obvious connection to Syriac Orthodox saints and theology, but also a prayer of Mar Audisho, a saint of the Church of the East, not revered in the Syriac Orthodox Church. So here you see Mar Audisho, who is not Syrian Orthodox at all. So this suggests a tantalizing East Syriac connection. On another fieldwork trip in 2010, I visited the Syriac Orthodox village of Asrok, again in the northeastern corner of Syria's Jazeera region. And there, an elderly deacon was reputed to read people their fortunes and write amulets for them. Interestingly, he determined people's fortunes by reading through a 17th century manuscript of the Anaphore, so the various types of mass celebrated by the Syrian Orthodox Church. He told me that he had learnt this craft from an old priest, so how to read between the lines of this liturgical manuscript and tell people their fortunes. He had learnt this craft from an old priest, but had promised that priest not to reveal the secrets to anyone else. The deacon did, however, allow me to photograph the manuscript, as well as his little and more modern book of charms and amulets in classical Syriac and Garshuni. With such thought-provoking clues in mind, I was tempted to assume that it may be possible for the Book of Medicines and other astrological and esoteric works to have either been authored or copied in the West Syriac tradition as well, but they have yet to surface. So this is what gave birth to my current research project. And this brought me, naturally, to Hummel. Thanks to the efforts of Hummel's dedicated team in digitizing manuscripts from church libraries all over the Middle East and other troubled areas, one can now consult items from multiple collections in one place as digital images or microfilms. Thus, through a quick search using Oliver, I was able to find more than 20 Syriac and Garshuni manuscripts in Hummel's collection, which deal with topics ranging from divination to charms, medicine, astrology, dreams, and magic. These hail from the libraries of the churches and monasteries in Diyarbakir and Mardin in Turkey, Aleppo in Syria, and also in Jerusalem. These are important because they hail from libraries which were largely, or are still largely, inaccessible to scholars. It goes without saying that these manuscripts have never been consulted in any previous studies of such literature before, and Hummel's resources are therefore essential to my research project. So, thus, from the Syriac Orthodox Church of the 40 Martyrs in Mardin, Turkey, we find at least 5 manuscripts dealing with divination, 4 with medicine, 1 containing charms, and another concerning dream interpretation, and yet another about astrology, etc., etc. Now, this modest collection of more than 20 manuscripts from at least 4 Middle Eastern libraries containing these texts was the impetus for my coming here to do research, and since I have come, I have found even more materials that have not yet been catalogued and uploaded to Oliver, including manuscripts from the collections of the Chaldean Catholic churches in Mardin and Diyarbakir, as well as church and private collections digitized by the Centre Numérique des Manuscrits Orientaux in Iraq. A partial search in the last 2 weeks, so just the last 2 weeks, looking through all the uncatalogued stuff, has already revealed fragments and entire sections of manuscripts containing charms and omens, as well as medical, astrological, and divinatory texts. At least 20 previously uncatalogued items in 4 separate collections. So the search, therefore, continues. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the dating before I get to the conclusion. So, concerning the dating of this core Syriac text of the Book of Medicines, if it is in fact true that a 5th century manuscript of the astrological component survived until the late 19th century in the remote Troma Valley, then this would confirm a link with the astrological traditions of ancient Mesopotamia. So here again is that remote valley in the southeastern part of Turkey's Hakkari Highlands. It has been shown that the temples of Babylon, Borsippa, and Kutha in southern Mesopotamia were active as late as the 4th century, and activity is attested as well at the temples of Nineveh and Ashur well into the Parthian period, where the Akitu festival, or New Year festival, was still being celebrated. Inscriptions from this period, mentioning deities of the ancient Mesopotamian pantheon, also survive in Hatrian Aramaic, from Hatra to Crete and Sinjar, as well as from a village in Turabdin. Moreover, the Aramaic inscriptions found... What happened? That's okay. Sorry. I pressed the wrong button. So, moreover, the Aramaic inscriptions found at the tombs of the kings in Jerusalem, where is it? There. Which house the remains of the royal family of Arbil. It has also been surmised that they shared a common language with the kingdom of Hatra, and prior to their conversion to Judaism in the 1st century, probably they also shared the same religion and the same gods. So, unfortunately, archaeological evidence is scanty. Here you can see the tombs of the kings, where the Jewish royal family of Erbil in northern Iraq were buried. This gives you an idea of Erbil in northern Iraq at the moment. That was the site of the old city, which is now the citadel of Erbil. It's undergone a huge reconstruction. And this is something I wanted to show about the kingdom of Hatra now. Kingdom of Hatra was in that area to the southwest of Mosul, in that central Mesopotamian desert. And this is a statue from Hatra of a woman. And this is an Assyrian Christian woman from one of the villages just outside of Mosul. And as you can see, the dress really hasn't changed over the 2,000 years. So if the dress really hasn't changed and the language is still some form of Aramaic, then I'm guessing that the Book of Medicines probably comes from that period as well, or maybe even older. So, I'm going to go on to the kingdom of Osroene, or Edessa. So here you have the area of the kingdom of Erbil, or Adiabene, and here you have the area of the kingdom of Osroene, or Edessa. Now, this kingdom is from where standard literary Syriac derives, And it's also noted for being a strong center of planet and star worship with a strong Mesopotamian connection. Something which appears to have been familiar to the Syriac philosopher Bar-Desan, and we also find accounts of planet worship as late as the 1300s in Islamic texts. So Haran, for instance, was a hub of the worship of Sin, the moon god, and this continued well into the Islamic period. And also you have the area of, so that's Haran, you also have the area of Solmatar to the east, where there are temples dedicated to the planets, complete with Syriac inscriptions dedicated to Mesopotamian deities, and life-size reliefs depicting priests wearing the same conical cap of the ancient Assyrian priests found in bas-reliefs from Nineveh, as well as frescoes from Dura Europos on the Euphrates River. And you can also find it at the site of Palmyra. So it shows you that there was some sort of a continuity from ancient Mesopotamia through the late antique period and then into the Christian period. So, regarding Palmyra, you not only have temples dedicated to deities with Mesopotamian names, so there's Palmyra there, but at least one funerary stele belonging to a Chaldean. And that's now in the Museum of the American University of Beirut. Now the acts of the Martyr Charbel in Syriac further attest to the celebration of the Assyrian New Year festival at Edessa well into the late antique period, and this has survived to some extent among the folk traditions of modern-day Assyrians of Hakkari and Turabdin regions, who in parallel to the ancient Assyro-Babylonian term Rishatu, or head of the year, call the beginning of spring Rishata or Rishato. Interestingly, this is also to be found amongst the Yazidis, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, given the recent events, who despite speaking for the most part a dialect of Kurdish, call the New Year celebration in Kurdish, they call it Saresal, which is a direct translation of the ancient Assyrian Rishatu, rather than the standard Kurdish word Nowruz, meaning New Day. And they also share many folk traditions with the Assyrians of Hakkari in this regard. In fact, many elements of their religion display ancient Mesopotamian origins, and even some of their deities have parallels to the ancient Assyrian pantheon. Sheikh Shams, for example, and Shamash, and Malek Taus and Nergal. Indeed, the fact that many of the names of the zodiac signs may have been standardized in the Seleucid era, as well as personal horoscopes not appearing until much later, point to an original Syriac translation and redaction of the Book of Medicines dating from between the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. Now, Wigram, who was writing in the early 20th century, may not have been too far off when he surmised that many of these Syriac amulets and charms had their roots in ancient Mesopotamian incantation texts. So the same may probably be discovered concerning the astrological and divination texts after more close study and comparison. So again, this is a amulet textbook which is kept in Chicago at the Ashurbanipal Library in Chicago. This was originally in Russia, it was brought over. And then this is also another one from Harvard. So there is actually a large corpus of these manuscripts. Probably the largest is in Russia at the moment in a private collection in St. Petersburg. I met with the owner of the collection earlier this year, and he told me that he has at least 80 of these amulet texts. Now, to the conclusion. There remains no doubt that there are more such untouched material lying, languishing in village churches and private collections awaiting future study. But for now, we must start with what is available. This research project is particularly significant because it aims to explore and document the rarely studied genres of fringe literature in the West Syriac tradition, bringing to light texts which are generally overlooked by mainstream Syriacists and those studying the history and literary heritage of the Middle East. It thus draws upon diverse approaches to science and divination, as well as folk medicine and magic, in the West Syriac literary tradition and to the origins and use of such genres. In particular, this project focuses on the extent to which such literature was prevalent in West Syriac communities and what role it played amongst them. Attention will also be paid to the translation of these texts from classical Syriac into Arabic or Garshuni. Moreover, the project will eventually contemplate the way in which such knowledge was transmitted, translated, and copied. The main outcome of this research is projected to be a critical edition of the West Syriac and Garshuni medical and magical texts, along with translation and detailed analysis of their contents. This commentary will include comparisons drawn with East Syriac literature and similar textual genres within other neighbouring communities. Such a volume is unique and unprecedented and will be a useful reference aid for researchers studying the transmission, translation, and copying of scientific and magical works between various ethnic and religious groups of the Middle East in the medieval and pre-modern periods. Moreover, it will greatly benefit our understanding of the place which such texts had within the West Syriac society at large and at various stages in their history. Comparable studies to date have fallen short on providing not only a specialized focus on the West Syriac corpus, but they have subsequently not been able to provide a comparative perspective with the East Syriac tradition, as well as other groups. This attempt to compare these texts with one another, as well as with those of other communities, will largely work towards compiling such vital information into one unified and contextualized study, and thus address lacunae present within current scholarly research. This project, therefore, aims to further produce a clear picture of the geographical distribution of such texts over the centuries, as well as provide a more relative analysis of this literary genre in the West Syriac milieu. Such a study is valuable because it will, for the first time, present a comparative and detailed overview of the development and usage of medical and magical texts among the West Syriacs. The result may then be used to further knowledge and understanding of ethno-religious and interfaith relations in the Middle East in particular, and especially in regards to such sharing of scientific and esoteric knowledge from one group to another. And I hope I haven't bored you, and I hope I haven't gone over my time. Thank you very much.
Hope you'll take a question or two from our audience.
No. That costs extra. No, I'm just kidding.
Anyone, please.
Yes.
I'm curious about the number of private collectors who hold documents. How likely is it that those would ever be potentially open for digitization and access?
Well, when I was in Syria, it was very funny. I was there just to visit my cousins. And I still have cousins living there, but I had many more before the current civil war. But I went to visit them, and I sort of realized, I'm bored. I'm bored because every weekend we have parties, we have weddings, we have engagements, we have this and that and the other, and I thought during the week there's nothing to do. So I thought, you know what, I'll just ask around and I'll see if anybody in the villages has anything that I can have a look at. And lo and behold, it turned out that some people had quite extensive private collections. I met someone who lived in an area just outside the main town, and he, in his house, in this huge box, like a huge cargo box, he opened it up, and he was the guy with that huge manuscript. So he had about 20 to 30 manuscripts, and that was the library of the church which his family used to serve back in Turkey. So, you know, they were the church wardens, or they were the people, like the caretakers of the church. When they escaped to Iraq and then to Syria, they brought the whole library of that church with them. And now it's kept in their house. Well, I don't know where they are now because they were planning to move to the States. But, you know, they let me photograph anything that I wanted. They were very, very accommodating. Some people weren't, but, you know, some people were. These people in particular let me photograph everything, including documents that was in the cache, any old black and white photographs, etc. Like, you know, school certificates from back in the 1930s or 40s. It was very interesting. If I had more time and if I had more equipment, I guess, I would have photographed more, but I limited myself just to photographing the title pages and the colophons of every manuscript. So at least now I've got a record and I can build up a checklist at least of what existed in 2010, and I can securely provide dates for those manuscripts and places of, you know, where they were copied, etc.
A lot of the pictures that you showed, the pictographs, were of the same thing. A horseman with a spear after a snake, a demon, or something else. Is that the same thing copied along, or what? Were they all different? That seem very similar if there were all that many different manuscripts.
Well, it's funny. In the same manuscript, you'll probably find 5 to 10 equestrian saints, and they'll look the same because they're executed in a very crude sort of folk style. But, you know, one will be St. George, one will be the angel Gabriel, and one will be Rabban Hormuz, one will be, you know, someone else. And the only way that you can tell is by the legend written in Syriac next to the illumination. The only difference, I would say, would be the angel Gabriel, because the angel Gabriel has these things which are meant to be wings. I think I pointed that out, but, you know, he's got these sort of things coming out of his shoulders that look like rays, but they're actually meant to be wings. And that's the only way you can tell the difference. But, you know, they're also, depending on the amulet, they're also meant to be attacking different things. So one would be attacking a stray dog, one would be attacking a demon, one would be attacking the spirit of lunacy, one would be attacking the evil eye, and you would see that he's plunging his spear into something that looks like this huge eye. So it's all in the details, I guess.
That's what I was thinking. It looks like the monsters were different,
Yes,
but the horsemen were the same.
yes. Well, I mean, if you're sort of drawing something like that, I guess you can't really show too much detail to make it look different. But definitely the monsters are different. Monsters are different.
I want to just say thank you very much because it was very interesting, and I think it's a huge work done actually, because I could understand how many manuscripts you have analyzed. And also for me it was very interesting that you also showed some Persian incantation fragments, which actually, is it, so the first question is it also Christian?
No.
Because it's looking like Islamic. And then it was also very interesting that you made a parallel with Aramaic magic bells. And of course, it is quite true that even the representations are very often the same. Like attacking dogs, it is like. I'm just. It's not. I don't know a lot of these things, of course, but I'm just interested if the magic bells are still in use now by Christians.
No.
Because.
No. Unfortunately, it seems to be something that has probably died out in the early Islamic period. Or I'm not sure if it was ever common in northern Mesopotamia. I'm not sure if they ever found magic balls from northern Mesopotamia, but either it was something more common to the south or it was something that died out in the Islamic period.
Thank you very much.
No worries.
So I think we'll, one more, Daniel, last question.
All right, I'll make it a quicker one. I would ask you to move it to a more interpretive role as opposed to the descriptive role that you've done so marvelously for us today. Deepesh Chakrabarti, who has been a major author, of course, with subaltern studies and the use of these technologies of transmission in India. I'm wondering how you would perceive this kind of continued use of manuscript culture in the modern era as a kind of reaction against perhaps modern forms of what he would call kind of capitalist or imperialist aspects within India, but also being here applied to the Middle East, and seeing these measures of manuscript culture as a kind of what he would call as a time knot to kind of provide a power mechanism for local cultures against things which they can have no power against within the state system. Is that part of your work to kind of move this into a type of subaltern interpretive stance, or are you simply interested
That's
in
very interesting, and I mean, it's a very interesting path for it to take. I know a lot of these charms or amulets, and even one that I recently found in the uncatalogued stuff in Hummel's collection, they deal with, it's a charm to have on you when you go to visit a judge or when you go to visit, somebody that's in a position of authority. And that would be a very interesting way to analyze that and to take it to a new level. Thank you very much, and I'll definitely look into it. If you could provide me with the reference, I'd really appreciate it.
So on behalf of all of us, let me thank Nicholas for this really fascinating talk, and I want to thank you also for your little plug for the work of Hemmel. So we could see that these traditions were still being passed down even to elderly members of these communities. So in one sense, maybe they were dying out anyway, but on the other hand, some of these communities you visited really no longer exist as such, because they've had to leave their homes, they've had to abandon this culture which they had already brought at great sacrifice from another very remote area. So I think this underscores the fact that what we do is really important, and also underscores the importance of having a younger generation of scholars who work with these materials. And we were able to bring Nicholas here through the generosity of the Swenson family, which has supported the fellowship, which has funded him, just as Jean Manas and Rebecca Haile brought Anton here, and then the Heckman Endowment has brought people from Ethiopia and elsewhere to be with us. So thanks to all of you for your support, if not financial, your prayers, your presence at events like this, and much more, Nicholas. Thank you.
Thank you.